Hi, everyone, and welcome to this panel event hosted by Bristol Ideas, where we will be discussing the global impact of the US Supreme Court's decision to overrule Roe versus Wade 1 year on. Before we get started, I would like to encourage you to sign up to the Bristol Ideas newsletter, and then you can receive information about more events like this, both online and offline. And also, please do follow us on social media. My name is Sian Norris, and I'm a writer and journalist and author of Bodies Under Siege, How the Far-Right Attack on Reproductive Rights Went Global, which was published this month by Verso. And I'm really excited today to be joined by two fantastic speakers who are on the sharp end of that far-right attack against sexual and reproductive health and rights, Rose Wakikona and Anissa Daboussi. So I'll introduce them both. Rose is a senior attorney at Womenslink Worldwide with a decade of experience in public interest litigation and human rights in and out of the courtroom. She specialises in sexual and reproductive health and rights and has been working for the past 6 years to ensure that only progressive laws and policies on SRHR are passed and implemented in Uganda. Anissa is Manager of Advancing Universal Rights and Justice at the Association for Women's Rights in Development. She previously worked for international NGOs and intergovernmental organisations such as IDEA, UNICEF, and FIDH, where she worked as a human rights researcher and advocate from 2017 until 2021. Anissa is passionate about women's struggles, anti-racist movements, and decolonial studies. And if you haven't heard of Womenslink Worldwide and AWID, as in the Association for Women's Rights and Development, I'd really urge you to go on their websites. They're both fantastic organisations doing really urgent work. And so it's an absolute privilege to have you both here today. So thank you for taking the time to join us. So Rose, I wanted to start with you because although I was planning this panel quite a long time ago, obviously the situation in Uganda where you work has become much more urgent in recent weeks when we think about the attacks on reproductive and sexual health and rights. We've seen this passing of an anti-LGBT bill, which is more draconian than one we've seen in a really long time. And after the kind of issues over a decade ago, when a similar bill was passed and then repealed, it feels like there's a really urgent situation happening for LGBTQ plus people and also the broader sexual and reproductive rights conversation in Uganda. So I was wondering if you could tell us briefly about this bill and what has led to it and what the reaction has been.
In my opinion, I think the urgency has existed for a long time. This is not something that happened suddenly. It is something that is a culmination of the work of the anti-rights and anti-gender groups. And it has been something that we have seen coming since, I don't know, I can go almost as far back as 2016, when there was a ban on comprehensive sexuality education, largely because the curriculums at that time were tackling issues to do with access to safe abortion, but also issues to do with sexual and gender minorities. And when that happened, we just sort of skipped over it. Then we saw the signing of the Geneva Consensus Declaration, where Uganda was a co-sponsor and a big shot within that particular space. And again, it's something that we just sort of glided over. We saw it in the resolution for the protection of the family at the UN level, which came again, and Uganda was one of the big people who actually participated in this particular space. But then again, when you come down to our national level, there were policies that were holding space for sexual reproductive health and rights that were suddenly withdrawn. We saw the guidelines on safe abortion that were withdrawn in 2015, the SRHR policy that was withdrawn in 2017, and then now you see it in the culmination when they adopted the sexual offences bill, which even within itself was criminalizing. I don't want to say criminalize, it was recriminalizing same-sex relations because they are already criminalized within the Penal Code Act, but then just adding other layers onto the criminalization itself. And when that was not assented to by the president last year, at the beginning of this year, we already had wind that since the sexual offences bill had not gone through as was anticipated, they were going to reintroduce the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which had already been introduced in Parliament in 2009. It was adopted, assented to by the president, and there was this whole press conference where he signed it on television, but then the courts had overturned it. And when they overturned it, they didn't overturn it on issues to do with principle in terms of how they align to human rights, but it was more of a technical issue, saying that the Parliament didn't have quorum in order to pass the law. So after 2014, there was a bit of a breather, but the expectation within the movement of sexual reproductive health and rights was that this bill was going to be reintroduced at any one time. So when we saw the sexual offences bill, we thought this was it, but when it wasn't assented to, we knew that a bigger bill was coming. So this is not something that shocked us. We have been seeing a lot of retrogression when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights within our context, not just in Uganda, but it's spreading across to Kenya. We are seeing it even spreading across to Tanzania and even Rwanda, which many consider to be a bit of a beacon of light within the East Africa region. We are seeing them hesitate to do things like recommit to the ESA commitments, which are the ministerial commitments within the country in order to provide sexuality education to adolescents. So for us, it's just a mark of the fact that our space in the sexual and reproductive health and rights regime has been hijacked by the anti-rights groups and the anti-gender groups, and they have a chokehold on our politicians, on our decision makers, on the people who have power. And this is now being reflected within our laws and our policies. So this act is just one of the many that have been eroded and taken away. And within this act itself, it just adds on to the criminalization of same-sex relationships, where they add on to other terms where they add layers of promotion, which of course target even NGOs who are working on sexual and gender minority rights. They even target people who rent out houses to people who are sexual and gender minorities. They put a duty on everyone to report as long as you suspect that someone is in a same-sex relationship or if they are conducting sexual relations with the same sex. And many people have been slayed by this particular law. We are seeing an increase in the arrests that are being made for sexual and gender minorities, the harassment. Every week you're hearing about mob justice, where people just look at someone and assume that they are gay, and then they'll just form a mob and waylay them. So our police is even doing more in terms of trying to protect people from mob justice than it is in terms of enforcing the law. So it's just an indication of the volatile environments that we have right now.
It's really frightening. And I think it's really interesting what you say about how it's been a long time coming, you know, it wasn't a shock, and how I feel really similar to that with Roe. You know, when Roe was overruled, if you'd been observing the trends, you could see that these patterns were coming, that chip away at rights. And then suddenly, you know, the big one goes. But actually, it's a real proof of why we need to be vigilant and why we need to be constantly defending sexual and reproductive healthcare and rights, because they're so easily eroded and then suddenly they're gone. I was wondering if you could speak a little more as well about those sort of anti-rights and anti-gender movements that have been attacking sexual and reproductive health, both in Uganda, but in the wider East Africa region, and whether we've got relationships between, you know, African organizations, but also organizations from the global north who are getting involved in this debate as well. Obviously, without, you know, wanting to libel anyone or have any kind of complicated namings, but just that sort of ecosystem, it'd be good to hear about.
Yes, so initially when we started seeing the attacks, most of the organizations were foreign. We had organizations like Family Watch International, Citizen Go, and they were largely white faces that were coming into the country and trying to push this religious ideology. And there was a call that, oh, Uganda is a religious country. Our motto reads, for God and my country, therefore we are for God, and we must align with biblical principles. But there was a bit of a pushback in view of the fact that most of these organizations, there's a bit of confusion, like why are these white people coming from here and then telling us that we need to align with this particular set of principles? So over time, we have seen them begin to incorporate organizations within the local context. So you will have organizations like Family Life Network, Empowerment of Youth Program, some of these different organizations that have then African faces, Ugandan faces, with Ugandan names, and they are speaking the languages. So then they become more visible to the people and more acceptable in the things that they are doing. So they are adopting the methodology of having Black faces preaching towards Black people, which makes their messaging more acceptable. And of course, they are coining it as being African values. This is something that is for us. Historically, Africa has been anti-LGBTQ rights. Historically, Africa has been anti-abortion rights, and coining it as if these things never used to exist even before colonization. And of course, they are in that same way attacking the human rights system, saying that the human rights system is inherently not African. Of course, painting the picture that when you look at the 1948 picture, when they were adopting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there were barely any Black people there. They were just white men who are signing this document, and now they want to impose it upon us. So these are some of the things that they are pushing forward. And of course, putting it within religion, you have to recognize that in Africa, when colonialism came in, most of our schools, most of our health institutions were then given to religious institutions. So you'll find that over 70% of our health systems are religiously owned. When you look at the schools, over 55% are religiously owned. The rest are by the government. So it brings to you already to the fact that these people are already in the grassroots, and they are pushing an ideology with already the popular grassroots people within their accordance, because then they'll say that in my health facility, I will not provide post-abortion care, I will not provide abortion. And you can't force them to do that, because already the institution has a religious foundation within it. Schools, the same way. When it comes to comprehensive sexuality education, they'll just refuse the curriculum and refuse to teach it within the schools simply because of the foundations of the school. So there is a lot of integration of state and the state and religion. And you find that now our first lady is a pastor, and she has a church, and her daughter has a church. So already there is that stronghold that they have within there. But every time you rip away from who is the face of these ideologies that are being fought, you will find that they are being funded by American organizations, especially American organizations, people from the family who have ties to that. You have Family Watch International, Citizen Go. These are some very huge funders of some of these people. They'll fund things like the National Prayer Breakfast, where some of these policies are grown and adopted. They funded the current interparliamentary conference within Uganda, which brought together African members of parliament to have a conference where they decided to adopt this ideology of only carrying African values and religious values for Africans, and rejecting all rights that are to do with sexual and gender minorities, but also the autonomy of women in regard to access to safe abortion. And from that particular conference, which was held in March, you now find that now Kenya wants to adopt a family protection bill, which was coined within that particular conference. But the funders of that conference are Family Watch International. So many of these organizations have learned to remain invisible, at least publicly, but behind the scenes, they are pulling the shots. And now these local, supposedly grassroots organizations are carrying forth this agenda, which is just wreaking havoc across the continent.
It's so interesting, and it's a hypocrisy that makes me really furious. And I know when I was reporting on abortion rights in Kenya, there was a woman who's a Kenyan representative of a European organization at the UN saying how abortion rights and LGBT rights are a form of neocolonialism. And yet, who is funding these organizations? Where are they based? They're based in Europe. They're based in the US. You know, I interviewed a leading gynecologist when I was in Kenya, and he was like, we've always had abortion in Kenya. We've always had abortion in East Africa. Our great grandmothers would practice this. It's always existed. It's not un-African. And yet these narratives about that are coming from these Western global North groups are so powerful, and powerful for understandable reasons. And I think it's a good time to bring you in, Anissa, because you've been looking at that sort of mainstreaming of anti-gender narratives, particularly in places like the United Nations and various parliaments. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the narratives that are having success in becoming more mainstream in these spaces, and the impact that that has when anti-gender actors, anti-gender narratives are being legitimized in these mainstream spaces.
Yes, sure. And thanks, Rose, for what you were explaining earlier. I think it's really fascinating to see the different approaches that they would take, those actors would take at the national level, and comparing it to what's happening at the multilateral, in multilateral spaces where we are watching them. I mean, first, maybe the who are they? We're really exactly talking about the same people, absolutely the same. The way we define them, these anti-rights actors, has evolved throughout the time within AWID. We've initially we had a strong focus on seeing them as fundamentalists. Then fascists and fundamentalists became the way we were talking about them, and now we're really calling them anti-rights actors based on their recognition that they're really coming for all of human rights. And we understand these actors being linked to religious fundamentalism, nationalisms, ultranationalisms, white supremacy, ultra-conservatisms, and other oppressive ideologies and movements. To cite a few of the ones that you were mentioning, Rose, already, CFAM, the Center for Family and Human Rights, with this very neutral sounding name, as most of them use. Their framing is around having a proper, quote unquote, conception of international law that is being endangered by the radical feminist ideology. So this is really their mandate. And some of the key activities that they do is lobbying at the United Nations, and particularly the Commission on the Status of Women, to defend life and family. They do all sorts of training, movement building activities within this lobbying scope, and they're based in New York and in DC. Alliance Defending Freedom, another one of these anti-rights actors that you also know very well, a very powerful anti-right actor, funded by a group of ultra-conservative evangelical Christian leaders. It has expanded significantly over the past decade. And the fact that they now have offices in all the important center of leadership in Europe, to influence both Geneva processes, so the UN, but also Brussels, Strasbourg, London, really tells us how much their international branch has expanded. And yeah, I think in terms of the type of strategy you were asking me about, that they use within the United Nations, we really describe it as a double, as a twofold strategy. The inside, let's start with the outside strategy. We see that they undermine, they try to limit or call for the defending of some of the UN mechanisms, such as the OHCHR, some treaty monitoring bodies, some of the United Nations special procedures. So there's a real attack on the outside, but at the same time, a real integration of what's happening inside, and a real play by the rule, or seemingly playing by the rule inside those spaces. to not abandon the institutions of power and try to influence from the inside the reshaping of human rights norms and human rights systems to promote their own anti-rights agenda. Sorry, that would further impunity, that undermines equality, and that makes human rights the province of the few rather than all. I don't know if I could give a few examples. For instance, at the last Commission on the Status of Women, which happened in March a few months ago, we had Families Watch International, CFAM were present, and this obviously, so this is just to give a recent example, but their presence in those spaces has an obvious impact on what's happening in those spaces. It has an impact on the fact that achieving any work that is related to achieving rights and liberation is increasingly being silenced, being attacked, being punished. And this is not new. This is a trend that since the early 2000s, probably we can date back example. And we see trends of delegitimization, persecution, closure of civic space. That's happening at the national level. That's also happening within multilateral spaces. Within the UN spaces, it can take the form of, for instance, obstacles for NGOs to get an ECOSOC status, which is the consultative status within the UN that enables you to participate into UN fora. And once NGOs and human rights defenders or feminists are inside, it can become intimidation, retaliation against the defenders who advocate in those regional and international human rights spaces. We have many examples documented of reprisals after activists engaged in some of UN processes. And about the ECOSOC status, the Human Rights Council NGO committee chair expressed concerns themselves that a large and growing number of NGO applications for consultative status continue to be perceived as arbitrarily deferred on politically motivated and repetitive questions by committee members. So this is really a trend also that we see growing. And then in terms of another consequence of anti-rights presence and enabling in those spaces is some attacks on even United Nations mandate holders in some cases, with often no consequences on the perpetrators. Just one example, Agnès Calama, when she was the special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, was issued a death threat after her investigation into the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in March 2021. Another one, the special rapporteur on rights of indigenous people, was targeted by her own government of the Philippines in 2018, labeled as a terrorist. So these are just indicative of the state of affairs where even those figures are in the firing lines.
And it's frightening, isn't it? Because we think of the United Nations as like a safe space, that's kind of why it was invented. And yet it's being so easily weaponized. And also people working in that context, as you say, are being threatened when they speak out for human rights and gender rights. And I think it's important to note that none of this is happening by accident, right? I mean, one of the organizations I talk about in the book is Agenda Europe, which was sort of a network that brought together many of the names we've heard today. And part of their sort of strategy was to get their people in the room, whether that was in, the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe or the United Nations or other kind of multilateral bodies. It wasn't that they suddenly woke up and decided to go. It's like this has been a concerted effort to get in there. And I was wondering too, if you could talk a little bit about how anti-gender movements and anti-rights movements are targeting different contexts. So, for example, we know in the UK, there's been a big backlash against LGBT rights and trans rights in particular, whereas perhaps in some parts of East Africa, abortion is the bigger issue, or in America, for a long time, abortion has been the big issue. Obviously, now that's moving more to LGBT rights. But how do they sort of target these different areas and different contexts?
I mean, I think one of the within UN multilateral spaces in general, we're seeing that there's really this context of extensive infiltration by anti-rights actors, and so they work jointly against the rights of women, LGBTQI people, minority groups, to basically undermine universality and weaken the ability of the system of the multilateralism itself to hold violators of rights to account. So we see that we cannot really counter any part of this problem in isolation. That being said, you have clear trends coming up at certain times against a specific target. Just to give an example, again, at the last Commission on the Status of Women in March, we saw, as every year at CSW, anti-rights actors gave the same usual talking points against sexual reproductive health and rights, against comprehensive sexuality education, and they did infringe on some feminist side events, on some parallel events. They used discriminatory language, disruptive tactics. What we saw was an intensified anti-trans rhetoric and mobilization. You had, just to give a few examples of what happened, we had official statements and articles condemning the transgender ideology, quote unquote, that were published by anti-rights organizations before and after the CSW. We had the screening of an anti-trans movie by a right-wing filmmaker titled "What is a Woman?" As one of the side events during CSW. We had also, again, Citizen Go posters and a bus driving around displaying a message: a woman is defined by biology, not ideology. So as in previous instances, the notion of gender here is seen as something like biologically determined instead of socially constructed, and they present it as a threat to society. So it's really repeating the same tactics and the same messages as it has happened in national context in multilateral spaces.
Citizen Go does love a bus. That's they've always got their anti-rights, anti-gender buses going around the place. And obviously the reason we're talking about LGBTQ plus issues as well is because so many of the organizations that were pushing back against Roe and pushing back against abortion are working, as you say, you can't tackle it in isolation. They're working across lots of different gender issues. But to bring it back to abortion, Rose, I was wondering if I could bring you in to talk about any signs that since Roe was overruled, there's been a bigger pushback against abortion in sub-Saharan Africa and East Africa. Are we seeing anti-abortion actors become more emboldened by the Roe decision? And have you seen any examples where they are using the arguments that led to the overruling of Roe to promote anti-abortion ideas or push back against any potential progress on abortion rights in the region?
Yes, it was not just Roe alone, but a culmination of very many things that were happening at the same time. So before Roe was passed, there was the GGR during the Trump to any access to post-abortion care for public health facilities, because 70% of our health budget is funded by USAID. And so it was directly affected by the passing of the GGR. Facilities like Mary Stopes had to see some of their clinics closed down because they didn't have the funding, since they refused to sign some of the agreements that they won't provide abortion care, and so many other health institutions were affected. As we're still grappling with the GGR, the GCD was signed, where the government, even within itself, was saying that we undertake not to provide funding for abortion within the country, which of course spilled over into post-abortion care. Uganda is predominantly poor. Most people only access healthcare through public health facilities. So if this service is not being provided, then that is problematic. And then as we were grappling with the GCD, then Rove v. Wade was overturned. Of course, Rove had its own problems, and the evolution of abortion rights has been a bit different from the way that it was conceptualized under Rove v. Wade, because for it was tackling directly with individual consent and privacy. When you come down to the human rights system in Africa, the African Charter doesn't have the right to privacy because apparently all Africans are communal in nature, so we don't need privacy, something like that. They had their own arguments, but the good thing about the African Charter is that it then went ahead within the Maputo Protocol to codify the right to abortion. So under Article 14, it gave the right to abortion to women of Africa, but the way it placed abortion, it largely conceptualized it around grounds. So it conceptualized it around the grounds to access abortion, where the life of a mother is at risk, where there are fetal abnormalities, and where you have suffered sexual violence. And many of the African countries went ahead to accept some of these codifications. So most of the jurisprudence that is coming out of the African continent is conceptualized around exceptions to abortion, because most of the constitutions go ahead to protect the life of the unborn fetus. So you'll find something like abortion is not allowed except it states those three grounds. And most women who want to access an abortion will find a way of wiggling around those three grounds to actually access an abortion. So it was on those grounds, and then you'll find that a lot of the jurisprudence then goes ahead to deal with the issue of public health because of the vast amounts of unsafe abortions that happen, and many women die because of it. So then they will mandate the provision of post-abortion care in most of the instances. You'll see it in the Malindi case in Kenya, but also in the GMM case that came out in Kenya. So those are some of the different ways in which the jurisprudence around access to safe abortion has sort of evolved within Africa. But then when it came to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it just made it seem as if now the anti-rights groups they almost gained credibility to say that, oh, our tactics are now working. And then there was this incredible push, whereas before things would happen slowly, and in maybe a year, you would have to fight one or two backlashes on a policy. Within 2023, we have fought, we saw the collapse of the East Africa Community SRHR bill, which was codifying the grounds on the Maputo Protocol, but also rights for sex workers, but also it went ahead on maternal health rights. It just collapsed suddenly. We also saw things like the AHA Act, which came out within Uganda, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which was now assented to and is fully law within our context, but also it is being replicated within Kenya, and there are now talks to table a bill before the East Africa Legislative Assembly that actually criminalizes same-sex relations across all East Africa community members. And then now we are also fighting another bill, which is the Assisted Reproductive Technologies Bill, which is again limiting access to ARTs for women who are not married, and also the use of surrogates for people who are sexual and gender minorities, but also for women who are single and seeking to have a child. And of course, saying that ARTs can only be accessed if you have the full consent of your husband. So all these, we've only seen 3 in just one. Even the year is not yet halfway through. So that emboldenment has created this wave where there are attacks coming from different corners. As you've heard me mention, like they are attacking absolutely everything. Nothing is safe anymore. And now for us who are on ground trying to protect the little that we have, you just wake up in the morning, it's like, oh, now they are attacking ARTs. Oh, now they are attacking breastfeeding. Now they are attacking. So it's just this move to attack. So even us, we cannot sit and pick and choose what we can work on and say that, no, me, I'm working on access to abortion, me, I'm working on CSE, I'm working on ARTs, like everything just needs to be handled comprehensively and as one package, because it's really what it is an attack on the autonomy. And they have turned the bodies of women into battlegrounds where we are just fighting to be afforded basic decisions, like even taking contraceptives on my own without my husband's consent, to have a child without a husband, just to have an abortion. All this is just being attacked all at once. So Rove Wade just emboldened everyone and gave them some bits of credibility. Also, the case within itself had been used in some jurisprudence within Kenya on access to safe abortion, I think also in South Africa. Again, majorly talking about the autonomy, but in terms of it being comprehensively used as jurisprudence, not so much, because of the way that access to safe abortion evolved within our court system.
And is that what you're seeing as well, Anissa, a sort of emboldenment across the anti-rights groups in these multilateral spaces?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there's this, I was recognizing when you were saying there's a bit of, it's fuzzy, you know, it's coming from all sides and it doesn't stop. So I think that I can relate also to, yes, some of what we're seeing, the fact that they would always be present, follow all sessions, take the seat, give a statement. Like there's no issue that they're gonna miss. So I think that's yes, one of the tactics that we can recognize throughout. I think in terms of content-wise, what we've been watching quite closely recently is the question of this new, not so new question of anti-trans narratives that kept coming up in one of the other recent examples. We had the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, who repeatedly propagated essentialist narratives around non-scientific, outdated perceptions of binary biological sex, that made a series of harmful statements calling for additional obstacles to legal gender recognitions and additional conditions, and calling for an understanding of discrimination based on sex-based rights, which, according to us, contradicts and regresses from the established international human rights standards and norms on gender and sexuality. And we see that this special rapporteur, which we've had conversation with, we've addressed letters to try to raise our alarms, is now, we see that a group like CFAM, for instance, is now reporting on their website what she's doing, and seeing that she angered the homosexual/trans lobby. So this is all obviously linked, and if not a coordinated mobilization, at least there are linkages, and the attacks against rights protection for trans people, but more generally on rights related to gender and sexuality. Again, we cannot understand them in isolation from hyper-nationalism trends, from religious fundamentalism trends, and from wider regressions and attacks globally. and within the UN context, this translates as attacks on the very content and structure of human rights concepts, institutions, and protections. So we see our work as feminists in those spaces as advancing the rights to bodily autonomy and to human rights for all. But we see that cannot be isolated from, in the case of trans people, the fight for legal recognition of each person's self-defined gender identity, expression, sexuality. And I think one of the ways to resist is perhaps to uphold some of the progressive jurisprudence, some of the progressive wins that feminist movements have had in the past in those multilateral systems, and in the shaping of international law, in the progressions made to human rights standards, norms, instruments. And so at the Human Rights Council, at their affiliated UN special procedures, within UN treaty monitoring bodies, we've had very strong wording, very strong, very progressive concepts being defined, upheld. And I think our job is really to make that known and to encourage feminist movements to bring them home and to show how that should be used as a reference, and how the multilateral system has worked and has been strong for feminist movements in some instances.
And that really nicely cues me up, actually, for my final question, which is about how we resist and what hope we have. We're in a time of backlash. There's been, the things that we've been discussing are showing that progress that we thought was secure has been rolled back, and that these attacks are coming from all different spaces and using any issue they can to undermine human rights and the rights of women, girls, and LGBTQ plus people in particular. But there is hope, and I do tend to try and veer towards hope even during the darkest times. And one of the things that makes me really hopeful in this has been the green wave in Latin America. I mean, unfortunately, due to the sort of trying to do a panel across lots of different time zones, we weren't able to get a South or Latin American speaker to join us. But we know that in Latin America, we've seen wave after wave of, more liberal abortion laws, decriminalization of abortion, bans being lifted in countries where it felt very, very fixed that abortion was always going to be severely contested and severely restricted. So we have been seeing progress in some contexts, and that's a really, I remember when Roe was overruled, I spoke to the Centre for Reproductive Rights, and they said that since 1973, 53 countries have advanced abortion laws and only 4 have rolled them back. So there is stuff to be hopeful about, but I was wondering, Rose and Anissa, if I come to you first, Rose, where do you have hope? I mean, are you hopeful that we can resist these anti-gender movements and that we can promote change for all of us?
Definitely, we are standing our ground. Now we became like soldiers in a battle zone, and we are trying to fight back with every arsenal that we possibly have. There is a lot of strategizing. I think the best thing that is coming out is the collaboration that is coming across the East Africa arm, and then the East Africa and the southern arm of Africa just collaborating together. When the Anti-Homosexuality Act was passed, we saw South Africa stand up and speak through its political leaders to our political leaders. And that in itself had its own impact, because when you have the African leaders speaking to each other, it says something different than if you have just people from the global north speaking to them. But if it comes from Africans themselves, then it speaks a great deal about the whole thing. So those collaborations, which never used to exist before, we are starting to form the connections, the synergies, and just to have a more cohesive and strategic output, when to keep quiet, when to speak out, Can we demonstrate? Because of course there is a recognition that the rule of law in majority of African countries is just, most of us are, especially Uganda, we are just under dictatorships. So there is no way you can just go to the streets and start marching. You disappear and no one will ever find you again. So these are some of the things. How then do we work under such a high risk environment, using the courts as one of our last line of redress, contesting the AHA within itself? There are 3 petitions before the Constitutional Court, but even in terms of access to safe abortion, we have cases ongoing within our Constitutional Court. Kenya has given us extremely good jurisprudence. When you look on the Committee on the Rights of the African Child, at the African Commission level, they have produced extremely wonderful jurisprudence when it comes to access to education for girls who are pregnant, and then they have to go to school. So thinking outside the box and looking at what are some of those regional instruments that we can, mechanisms that we can use, that some of our governments can be able to oblige. So we have the East African Community, the East African Court of Justice, but we also have the African Commission. And of course, there has been a lot of backlash for countries. We've seen Tanzania, after it had some decisions passed against it, withdrawing its jurisdiction from the African Court of Justice. We've also seen it try to withdraw from the East African Court of Justice, because again, those are some of the mechanisms that we have decided to use, but also pushing through the African Commission for them to adopt general comments and resolutions. They have released a resolution 279, which is in terms of protecting sexual and gender minorities from violence. It may not go as far as explicitly recognizing the rights that are accorded to them, but it is recognizing that inherent dignity that lies within every single person, and prevailing upon African countries not to mete out violence on people who are of a different sexual orientation or who subscribe differently from the way that things are. They are recently also adopting resolutions on intersex and also on FGM. So for us, these are small wins, but they go a long way in trying to build consensus at a continental level, especially where the atmosphere is extremely volatile. But for now, we are standing our ground, trying to protect the small wins that we have in terms of the Maputo Protocol, which is the next point of attack for the anti-rights, because it's coming up for review this year and next year. So there is a move by the anti-rights movement to attack some of those critical clauses within the Maputo Protocol, especially Article 14 on access to safe abortion, trying to take it out of the protocol. So it's our duty to stand our ground and make sure that it even goes beyond what it says it would.
Thank you. And Anissa, where do you have hope for resistance?
I think I would answer something similar as Rose. I think in coming together as feminists and as feminist movements to fight back, because yeah, they're strong, but so we are, no? And I think within the remits of the work I do and the multilateral system and watching what's happening, and I think we've seen quite a strong mobilization of feminist movements, both for gaining progress in human rights norms and language related to gender and sexuality, but not only. And I think as civil society in general active in those spaces, we obviously have a vested interest in upholding the integrity, the credibility of the UN human rights system and mechanisms. So I think this part is always powerful. You can be critical, you can challenge the system, but at the end of the day, what you want is upholding its integrity to gain those progress. And yeah, I think we do have the numbers. We are the majority. So I feel like both in pushing for more progress and in exposing what anti-rights actors are doing, the way they're like exposing what they essentially are, which is fascist and fundamentalist, and the way they do things in a dishonest and using disinformation, using I think these are really the threads we have to hold the fort and push for progress.
Absolutely. And I finished my book with that point, you know, we're a movement too, and they don't have to win, you know, like it doesn't have to go their way. And not to just do a little plug of the book, but the book does look at those kind of forces and linking up that sort of fascist ideology and fundamentalism with these anti-gender movements and how they network and how they push their agenda. But thank you so much. It was absolute privilege and joy to speak to you both. I feel so lucky that we got this panel together, and just want to say a huge thank you to Rose Wakikona from Womenslink Worldwide and Anissa Daboussi from AWID, and to Bristol Ideas for having us. And yeah, thank you for such a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. And yes, we can go out in solidarity and collaboration and push back against these anti-gender forces. And as you say, we can win. So we're now joined by Bethany van Kampen-Saravia, who's a senior legal and policy advisor at Ipas, an NGO based in the US that seeks to increase access to safe abortions and contraception around the world, and also campaigns around gender rights more broadly, including LGBT rights and sex education. So Bethany, thank you so much for joining us. Really great to talk to you. And I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about the situation we are in right now. You know, this panel is going out in June 2023. It's a year since Roe was overruled by the Dobbs decision. And from your position as an activist and a legal advisor in this area, what are you seeing in the US right now in terms of the impact of Roe being overruled on US women, girls, and pregnant people?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Sian. I'm very happy to be here with you all today. The impact has been devastating. You know, Roe was never enough. There were always issues around access, accessibility, affordability. Abortion care was always out of reach for many communities and marginalized groups within the United States. But what the Dobbs decision has done, and what we've seen in the past 12 months since this decision came down, is that it has just wreaked havoc on abortion care in this country. Nearly 20 states have moved to either entirely restrict abortion access, to ban abortion, or to heavily restrict it in a way that accessibility eludes most people. So now we're looking at a situation where 22 million women and girls of reproductive age in the United States are living in a state that heavily restricts, if not completely bans, abortion. We're talking about bans before 6 weeks, when most people don't know that they are even pregnant. And so what we're seeing is what Ipas has been seeing in the environments that Ipas has been working in restrictive settings for the past 50 years, stories that we have heard from around the world, we are now seeing here in the US. And so what that looks like are people who are being criminalized. We see medical providers who are calling the police if someone has been suspected of self-managing an abortion in a state with a ban. We are seeing providers who are wanting to consult with legal advisors before they can treat a patient. Many in emergency situations where time is of the essence, and they're not able to perform their duties and to maintain their the oath that they have taken as medical providers to do what's best in the interest for their patients and to protect their patients and care for their patients. Their hands are tied. And so we're seeing, this every day, and we're hearing new cases of this each and every day. And it's heartbreaking. It's devastating to see what is happening, and then to see in states where we do have protective measures, where access still exists, the health systems are so strained. They're trying so hard to absorb the influx in patients. So particularly areas where we see like Illinois, right, for folks who are coming from the Midwest. We're seeing this in states like North Carolina, right, where people are really flooding from the South. But even North Carolina just passed a new ban that will go into effect on July 1st, although we will challenge that, and there will be a legal challenge as of right now that will become effective on July 1st, just in a week or so. And so the systems are incredibly taxed. And that means waiting periods. That means providers that are burnt out, that are struggling, that are exhausted. And it means further barriers for people who are already traveling miles, days to reach that care.
And of course, there's so many layers in that, aren't there? Because we know that when we even think about traveling, that there are some women who just won't be able to travel anyway. So again,
Absolutely.
we come up with a tiered healthcare system where those who have the means and flexibility to travel are able to, but so many women are left behind. And no woman should have to travel anyway, but there's this tiered issue.
No, and I want to also mention that when we're talking about the logistics of what it means to travel in that way, not only is it an issue of economic means, right? It's being able to take time off of work. It's being able to coordinate childcare. We know that most people who have abortions are already mothers. It also means that for someone who may not be documented, that they will be traveling possibly in Texas or in another state where they could have to cross an immigration checkpoint and possibly risk being separated from their family or deported to get that care. There's so many different levels that come into all of this when we deny access in the communities where we live. When we force people to travel, it opens up a Pandora's box of different obstacles, a literal obstacle course for people to have to get that care.
And you were talking about, the sort of strained services. Is that a legacy of the kind of past few decades where we've seen these trap laws come in that have meant abortion clinics closing down, even in states which might have more liberal approaches to abortion or which haven't put in bans yet?
Yes, I think that the systems are very strained, as we said, but even in North Carolina, the bill, the ban that just passed, which is a 12-week ban, and that is largely what it does, but there are, dozens of pages in that bill of more restrictions than before. There are so many provisions. And one of them is on standards, on these standards that the clinic, ambulatory surgical center standards that the clinic would have to meet, which so many of them can't. They just simply cannot. And so, we still see iterations of these trap laws happening today as well. And, the clinics I think are doing all that they can, and people are working overtime. In North Carolina, what we're hearing is that, people are working around the clock, doing appointments, around the clock to help people now, because they know what's coming later this summer with this ban. And so they're trying to do everything that they can in the moment, but it's hard.
On a sort of, in these very difficult and strained times, there is some room for optimism. We've seen referendums and votes pushing against the anti-abortion movement, and a sort of swelling of outspokenness for the pro-abortion position. Perhaps people who were quietly pro-choice or didn't think about it are becoming more vocal. I mean, what sort of, if you took the temperature and how it is in the US at the moment, do you see a kind of move towards pro-abortion positions, or people, getting angry about the fact that these bans are coming in?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. And I think that's what, that's definitely what gives me hope. I have a daughter who's almost 2 years old. And when I think about what her future will look like, and what, you know, these next years will look like, and what it will look like in 10 years or more. And, you know, while it is scary, you know, in some ways, I do think that, you know, I know that we're the majority. To start, the US is going against the fast global trends of liberalization. So just in the past 20 years, there have been over 40 countries that have liberalized their laws. 44, including the US, have gone the other way. El Salvador, Nicaragua, Poland, United States. Against 40 others, right? I mean, we've got it wrong. We've got it so wrong here. And so, you know, when we look around the world and we see Argentina and Chile, when we see Ireland, the DRC, recently in Benin, I mean, we are against the global trend, and it will be made right. It will. And I think that we have, you know, definitely a groundswell and having a new energy and momentum on this issue. And I think part of what that is that it has become so personal for many, many people. You know, I'm someone who is a mother. I'm someone who also had an abortion as a young person. You know, one of the things that really called me to this movement was the fact, my own lived experience of someone who had an abortion at 19 years old, who did face various obstacles, including, you know, trying to be tricked at one of the crisis pregnancy centers, a fake clinic, and many other things as well. And, you know, when it becomes truly personal, you know, your state has a ban. You were able, let's say, to get care in the past, and now you know that your family, that others, that who you care about and love are not able to, because of what your state legislature has said, because of what the Supreme Court has said, to open the floodgates and allow for these state level restrictions to ban what is healthcare. You're furious. You're furious. And when you're furious, you do something, right? You vote, you take action. Mm-hmm. And that's what we are seeing and will continue to see. We know 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in their lifetime. And that is probably a gross underestimate. And so, you know, this is deeply personal for so many. And I think that is what will get us through this. And I think what will turn the tides.
And I think it's, you know, those personal stories and those personal experiences and making people relate to the women in their lives is something that was so effective in Ireland. You know, when the Irish referendum happened, the aunties were there with their really grotesque graphic posters and saying horrible things about women. And the yes vote was like, here are the women. Here we are, like, we're your neighbors, we're your sisters, we're your mothers,
we're your community. Yes.
Yeah, and it changed people's minds far more powerfully than being sort of yelled at by people who have a, you know, quite a difficult and nasty agenda. I wanted to move on slightly from Roe to another piece of legislation, which I know you are an expert in, and perhaps one that's lesser known in the UK, and that's the Helms Amendment, which is a 50-year-old piece of legislation and slightly different from the global gag rule, which I think British audiences are for some reason more familiar with, that prevents federal funding being used to fund abortion care. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the efforts to get to change Helms, particularly in light of the conflict in Ukraine and the pressures that that's putting on women who have unwanted pregnancies in all contexts, but also as a result of rape as a weapon of war.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I'll first say you're not alone in having more familiarity with global gag rule than Helms. I think that's true around the world, and it's something that we work to change, because global gag rule is horrible. It's a terrible policy. It gets much more attention in press, and part of that reason is because the global gag rule added insult to injury. Helms was before the global gag rule. It, as you said, it is implemented as a full abortion ban using U.S. foreign assistance. So in other words, if you accept U.S. foreign assistance, none of those funds, not a penny, can go towards abortion services, abortion training, abortion equipment, nothing, even in cases of rape, incest, life endangerment, and even to just talk or counsel someone on abortion as a legal option for them, despite the fact that there are these types of exceptions to the law, which I'll explain in just a moment. But yes, the Helms Amendment is something that we work very, very diligently to repeal. And we do that through a piece of legislation, which is called the Abortion is Healthcare Everywhere Act, that we have here in the US Congress. It's both in the US House of Representatives, closed last conference with almost 190, last Congress with almost 190 co-sponsors. This Congress, we're at around 160. That number will continue to grow, even with the change in leadership in the House. And we've got nearly 30 senators who are supporting that bill as well. And so, we are very, very excited to one day fully repeal the Helms Amendment. But until that day, there are these exceptions. And that's where the piece with Ukraine comes in that you mentioned, Sian, because as written, Helms does not ban the use of U.S. foreign assistance for abortion services in cases of rape, in cases of life endangerment, and in cases of incest. And so in places like the Ukraine and humanitarian settings and war-torn settings where rape is endemic, where rape is used as a tool of war, it is absolutely essential that comprehensive reproductive care be provided to people, and not just services around contraceptive care. We need abortion services to be available, full stop. They have to be. And so even though this exception exists and can be implemented, the Biden administration sadly has not. They have not implemented these exceptions. They have not communicated about these exceptions. They've remained utterly silent. In that omission, what it's done is allowed this policy to continue being implemented as a full ban for no legal reason. There's no reason for that to happen. You would think that they would be doing everything in their power to implement this, to be providing services for survivors of rape, particularly in humanitarian settings, but they have not. And what's worse is that we also have an exception that I mentioned that allows for the provision of abortion counseling, sharing information about abortion, and even referral. And so I want to make that clear. What that will look like is that if there is someone who goes into a clinic that receives U.S. foreign assistance and they are pregnant and they don't want to be, that provider is able to tell them if abortion is legal in the country, right? They have to give counseling that is consistent with the local law. That makes sense. But they're able to give them comprehensive pregnancy counseling on all of their options, including abortion. They're able to provide all information about abortion, on what is legal, on comprehensive counseling, as I said, and even where they can go. So that can mean the difference between someone potentially being turned away, saying, we don't do that here. Sorry, we can't help you. What does that mean? Someone is going to find another way. We know that when someone has decided to end a pregnancy, they are going to do it by any means necessary. That can mean someone turning to methods that are unsafe, that could cost them their health, their well-being, and even their life, versus a provider saying, yes, abortion is legal up to 14 weeks. I cannot provide you that care here because we accept U.S. funds and because of the dang Helms Amendment. Obviously a provider is not going to say this, but they're going to say, I can't provide that for you, unfortunately, but let me tell you where you can go. Abortion is safe. Abortion is legal. If that is what is the best option for you, I can help you get that care.
I think a lot of people as well would find it really shocking that, this amendment means that despite abortion being legal in countries, people are being
Yes.
told by the US that they can't provide it, and
Yes.
or they can't, you know, and
Yes.
it's a really sort of shocking power dynamic that needs to be shifted and changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interference. It's political interference at its worst. And who is the US government to say, okay, let's look at DRC. Okay, you've made a conscious effort to reduce maternal mortality in your country due to unsafe abortion by changing your laws, by allowing abortion to be completely available and free up to 14 weeks. You have done that, but yet the US government knows better. And so we're not going to help you in any way implement this policy. And now what needs to be said, and clearly said, the US is the largest donor of these funds. So global health funding, which is where reproductive health and family planning funding lives, we are the largest donor in the world. So it's not just that we're, interfering, meddling a little bit. This is millions and millions of dollars. This can be the entire livelihood of clinics. And are they going to do anything to possibly jeopardize those funds that could close their doors? No, of course not. So it's not just interference, it's worse, right? It is this complete control using funding and expelling this ideology that is completely contradictory with what their government and their ministries of health are trying to do for the betterment of their community. And so it's heartbreaking, it's devastating, and it's sadly, it's not surprising.
Well, fingers crossed that the bill keeps progressing. It's such an important piece of change and will have such a massive impact on women and girls' lives all over the world. And fingers crossed that things, as you say, there is progress. The global trend is towards progress, and it doesn't have to, as I keep saying every time I talk about my book or do any panels, it's like we're a movement too, and they don't have to win. Like we've won before and we can win again. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Bethany. It was really great to talk to you and really good to talk about Helms, because I know when we spoke before, it's something, as we say, that people aren't very aware of. And it is a really, it has such a huge impact globally on women's reproductive health. So just to wrap up, that's been a fantastic panel, and thank you everyone for watching online. Don't forget to sign up to the Bristol Ideas newsletter to get information about more events like this and to follow us on social media. But for now, I'll just say thank you to everyone for joining us, for the panel itself, for Amy and Zoe for organising, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.